Hey, hello. I want to explain how private endpoint works in Azure. You must be hearing a lot of things like private endpoint, private link service, service endpoint, and many things. And honestly, Microsoft has done a great job confusing people on these various jargons. So I'm sure, like me, you might be confused. So let's get this simplified and let's understand how it works. So, at its simple, to access any machine, right, or a resource, is you need something like an IP address. Now, where from the IP address is assigned, it's basically a network access card. Let's say, to understand the basic thing, you have a VM or a desktop, and now when you connect to a network, you get an IP address. Now you can literally have four or five IP address to reach to the same machine. And what is that? So that if you have five different network card, right, then you can. So private endpoint fundamentally is nothing but a network interface card, you can think, which assigns an IP address for that resources. But the interesting thing here is that the private endpoint or network interface doesn't reside actually in the same network where your private link or private resources are there. It's actually at your more at a client side, and that's the most important part. Let's say for this example here, we want to access an Azure AKS cluster and in a private cluster in a private way, so it doesn't expose to a public internet. For that we need to create a private endpoint in a vnet where we have a VM where from we are trying to access it. And that's not only for AKS, it for every PaaS services, because PaaS services are not part of the VNet you are creating. It's actually managed by Microsoft in their own network. It's a platform as a service. So how do you establish the connectivity? And that's why private endpoint is basically assigns a private IP address for that remote PaaS service. So and that's a very important concept. So it's just a way, and how that resolution happens, how that connection happens from that private IP, of the private endpoint to that, that's magic Microsoft does internally. You don't know how it is done. It That is what it's called private link service. And that's why people get confused often. What is that private link? Private link service is basically a service which enables a private endpoint, which is nothing but a private IP address present at the VNet side, to establish a connection to the target, which is a private link resource. That's what it is. And now, a lot of time, you see that this IP address is ephemeral. That means if you restart the cluster, you might get, or if you restart this private endpoint, you might get a new private IP address, and that's why you can rely on that. That's where the DNS comes into picture. So that is why most of the time, let's say for AKS, it comes with a private DNS automatically, and the private DNS has an authoritative record, an A record, which maps a fully qualified domain name to the private endpoint, a private IP address, which actually allow access to this private. So this is little complex, but once you understand and have a diagram in your mind, you can easily understand, and you can easily able to get it. I hope this explanation helps and this diagram helps. Put me in comments if you wanted to know more. And by the way, there is a very good blog from Microsoft, which has clearly explained how this works. And maybe you want to go quickly one by one. So it says that, private cluster using private endpoint. So for customers looking to avoid public exposure to their resources, the private endpoints would be a solution. A private AKS cluster disable public endpoints and creates a private endpoint to access the control plane. As a result, access to the cluster for kubectl and CD pipelines require access to the cluster private endpoints. So you see here, the kubectl doesn't get access directly through the public endpoint. It has to, there is a jump box which connects to the control plane via private endpoint, which is a private network interface card, you can think of, assigned to it. So let's see how it works. So if you see how it works in practically, for a AKS cluster, we create a simple color resource group, and then we say create a private AKS cluster and enable private AKS cluster. This is the key, and when you select that in GUI or in command line, it creates that additional things needed for private access, which is private DNS zone and private endpoint. Now see, okay, now we create private cluster. Now see, okay, show, well, let's see, does it have an fqdn, to connect it. So it gives you an fully qualified domain name, but initially it's a public. You can actually, and that resolves to a private address. This is very important. You have public fully qualified domain name which resolves to a private address. Now you can disable that. The private address is this, is used by the private endpoint to access the control plane. And the private cluster still by default exposes the fqdn resolving the private end, mm, endpoint ip address. In private cluster, the exposed um, public fqdn could be disabled. Now we can disable that, and that's why there's a command, you should disable it. You don't need, if you do not need it. But again, this is another thing, is you sometime enable it for your debugging in your development environment. You can still do that. But the concept is this: there is a fqdn which you should use to connect it. And then this is basically, you can basically then query, and then if you disable it, you don't get resolved an IP address, for the public IP address. No public FQDN also available. And then the following is a print screen. So another important thing is, when we create this PaaS service, Microsoft basically creates its own managed resource group. The same thing with, a Synapse cluster or anything, and then they created a lot of additional resources like private DNS zone, private private endpoint, network interface, all these things, so that it can allow connection in the privately. So this is very confusing little bit initially, but once you know, it's easy. So private AKS creates a new private DNS zone by default, as you was telling, because the IP may get changes, so it's better to connect via DNS. But you can bring your own DNS zone. Let's take a closer look at the private DNS now. It adds a record to resolve an IP address to the private endpoint, and that's what I was explaining you. If you look in this entire URL, right, and this entire thing, here the first part is, how it for AKS. So you have, uh, this is your region. Which region is it? It's in East West Europe. So any private endpoint will have this pattern with the region name, and this first part is basically your DNS server IP address, DNS server name, private DNS server name, and DNS zone name basically. And then you see this one is very important. This one is basically, is the host name, or you can think, which maps to your private IP address of the target resource or your past resource. So when you access it, you give this dot this entire thing to access. That's your fully qualified domain name. And that's why you see here, it gives you a cache. So query private fqdn, you see private fqdn is your name of your this name of your host name, which is in the a record. And then you have your DNS zone name, uh, and then you have private link dot west us ak azmks8ns.io. So that's a very important concept. And if you will forget for some time if you don't do work on it regularly. And the private fqdn is resolvable only through private DNS zone. And that's where we wanted to reach. Everything is private, no internet connectivity. There are some important things to consider, which I was telling. Restarting private DNS private cluster will recreate the private endpoint with a different IP address. That's why DNS is need in a hub and spoke model. more attention is needed to the managed to manage the private DNS zone. So most probably most people use hub and spoke model like Azure WAN, where your all your network is actually peered, not peered to each other, rather peered to the hub, and that's enable like connectivity instead of a full mesh. And that's a separate topic. And another important thing is that when you use this private cluster, let's say you need to use GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps, you cannot use the Azure DevOps GitHub Action Agent or Azure DevOps agent. You need to use the self-hosted agent, and that agent, the self-hosted agent, has to be in the same network where it has access to the private DNS zone. And there's no support for converting existing AKS cluster into private cluster. AKS control plane supports adding multiple private endpoints. That's true. IP authorized range cannot be applied because that's only for the public one. To connect to the private cluster, consider a dedicated to connect to so the dedicated section below. There are pros and cons. No public endpoint is exposed, and which is basically zero trust principle. Worker nodes connect to the control plane only using private endpoints, but it's very complicated. You need to set up. That's when a lot of expertise. A true private cluster is only possible during cluster creation, not possible for existing clusters. So you cannot really convert an existing cluster into private cluster. That's something. So this is the hope this will help you. Put me a comments in YouTube video.